Astrology is assured of recognition from psychology without further restrictions because astrology represents a summation of all psychological knowledge of antiquity. That is from the Carl Jung, famous psychologist. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be in this beautiful planet of ours. This is Inspired Living Radio. I'm your host, Marc Lainhart, the Intuitive Prospector. Thank you so much for joining us for the live broadcast. And if you missed the live broadcast, you can always go over now to your favorite podcasting platform and catch 6 seasons of Inspired Living Radio. Today, we're going to be talking about astrology. We're going to be talking about the tarot. We're going to be talking a little bit of numerology. And we're welcoming me back to the show after a few years, the wonderful Kathy Buell, who will be joining us here in just a second. If you want to follow the show on any of the social media platforms, you can always visit us and join the 2,000 inspired listeners from around the globe over on our Facebook page, and that's just called Inspired Living Radio and Podcasts. We've actually updated the page now to incorporate podcasts. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Inspired for Us, and you can always go to any of the platforms like iTunes or YouTube or SoundCloud or Spotify and catch all the rerun shows, including this one today. So we go live every Wisdom Wednesday at 12 p.m. Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern here on the Om Times Radio Network, where you can listen to the show from any device around the world. And no username, no password, no BS. And we really love doing radio and doing these shows to inspire you, to be inspired. And I always like to say, inspire before we expire. If you want to learn more about me, you can visit me at marclainhart.com or just do an internet search on the Intuitive Prospector so we can do a little bit of spiritual prospecting for your own spiritual gold. And without further ado, we're going to welcome Kathy Buell back to Inspired Living Radio. Like I said, it's been a few years. She was on the show a couple years ago, and we touched base and said, hey, let's catch up. Let's talk about all things astrology, numerology, what the year has been, what the year ahead is going to look like. A little bit about Kathy. She's a professional astrologer who's been exploring and explaining the role of the sky down here on Earth since her teens. She delivers astrology you can use, blending grounded, practical explanation and tips with humor, optimism, and a love of patterns, symbolism, and pulp culture references. Her forecasts and private sessions alike help individuals and businesses owners make decisions and better understand and laugh about themselves, their opinions, and the people in their lives. Her work draws on her uncommonly diverse life experience as an attorney, small business owner, performing artist, and writer. That experience inspired the label Professional Aquarian as shorthand for her multiple self-employment tracks, which have coexisted on a bridge between intuition and the rational mind for more than 30 years. If you want to learn more about Kathy Buell, you can visit her website at empowermentunlimited.net, and you can also find her at Best American Psychics, where we've been friends and colleagues since, about 2012.
Long time.
I joined Best American Psychics. So, Kathy, welcome back to Inspired Living Radio. How are you, my friend?
I am happy to be here.
Well, happy to have you back on. Let's talk all things astrology. Let's talk all things tarot. People are listening. They want to know what is going on in the world.
Mm-hmm. Oh boy, where to even start with this? We're in a really tumultuous month, culminating a really tumultuous couple of years. And at this point, we are assimilating very different perspectives, all kinds of things that we previously thought about ourselves, our lives, all kinds of philosophies that we had about, or what we believed to be true about ourselves, about certain relationships, about the way the world works. For most of us, that has just moved into a very startling different place. And a number of things have forced us into getting extraordinarily clear about what's most important to us, simplifying, stripping down, slowing down, and now really going for a new sense of what life means to you, and a willingness to toss out anything that's inconsistent with that, no matter how long it's been in your life. Would that match what you've been observing?
It would actually, and when I started talking about our Roaring Twenties 2 years ago, you can go back and listen to some of the shows where we talked about how the Roaring Twenties were going to come in a very powerful, transformative, chaotic way. Because the 20s, from numerology standpoint, and we'll talk a little bit about numerology, but today we want to focus on astrology because I'll be on your show in a couple weeks and we'll focus on numerology and kind of piece it all together. But from the the numerology standpoint, that base number of 20 is based with the energy of opposition, contending with two different forces, trying to find common ground. So I knew when we were going to come into this decade, Kathy, that we were in for a show. I've also, being in medicine for 25 years, I knew that this pandemic was going to be very transformative, very tragic for a lot of people around the world as well, with as many people as, have passed over into the spirit world. But we also know from history past that pandemics change us. If you go back even to, the 1600s of the Black Plague, when workers started to come back after 2 years and almost 25% of the population, dying from the Black Plague, you gave rise to the modern worker. And we're going to see a lot of that with this pandemic as well, from a numerology standpoint, from an astrology standpoint, that awakening, that coming to a more balanced life and not just necessarily working, 60-hour work weeks is going to change for all of us. In fact, I just saw, and we'll talk about this in the show, about infrastructure for 2022, because that's called the master builder number as well in numerology. But I just saw a bill proposed of going to a 4-day work week. I don't know if it'll pass with government, but I thought it was kind of interesting to even have this. Well, maybe we go like France and have 32-hour work weeks and get paid to do the same. Wouldn't that be nice?
Interesting. Although those of us who are self-employed, ... I want to throw in one other little historical parallel, or two actually, with the Black Plague. And one of them was that led to a societal evolution that created the middle class. And secondly, it also led to a huge cultural, literary, creative flowering and a change in thought. And that is definitely coming to the fore next year. How's that for a spoiler?
Spoiler alert, spoiler. Just two professional psychics sitting around for the next hour talking about what they see coming. I love it. And it's not just with that. It's not just here on the planet. I think, in this next decade of our Roaring Twenties of transformation, look at everything that's going on with space exploration and how the space travel is opening up and moving past our planet. And look at how Antarctica, two of the things I've talked about that will be very eye-opening is what's going to take place down in Antarctica, a continent that hasn't really been discovered as global warming starts to, melt that ice. And as we move as a species out into the universe, which I find so fascinating, and have done several shows the past year and a half on that. But that's going to be added to this transformation and about us as a species and what's going on here on the planet. But, for our listeners out there, I have to say, I know there's a lot going on in the world. I know there's a lot of changes and chaos. But, I have to say that the year of 2022 is also known as hope, that hope is ahead. And it's called, in numerology, the corporate peacemaker. So twos are about peace and coming to terms with that. But in order to get to that point, you got to go through all this turmoil, right?
Oh, yeah. And next year actually has a split personality. We got a little bit of a foretaste of it from May to July this year, tiny bit of a foretaste. But what I'm focusing on here is the transit of the planet Jupiter. Jupiter is the great beneficent, the great benefactor. I call him the guy that ups the ante of any action he gets near. Jupiter just makes things bigger. And people say, is that good? Well, it just means more, could be really good, a lot more good, or a lot more just insanity. But it's also an influence of indulgence, and it's very nuanced. He's subtle. You don't often see it coming. Jupiter at the end of December is moving into his traditional home, Pisces, which rules the interconnectedness of all life, of all existence. It is a sign of absolute boundlessness. And in April, Jupiter is going to meet the modern ruler of that sign, which is Neptune, the most boundless influence in the sky. So we're going to have maximum boundlessness, maximum transcendence, maximum compassion, maximum hooey, gaslighting, you name it. This is quite the spectrum. Neptune's everything from insanity to drug abuse to ecstasy. It's just completely unhinged from worldly experience. So next year, in the first 7 months of the year, Jupiter is going to be in this watery, soft, there's hope, things are great, there's a possibility of amazing creativity with this, particularly as he moves towards his meeting with Neptune. And he'll be back there at the end of the year from October to December. But in the middle, he goes into fiery, me first, daredevil Aries. So after this kind of floaty, oh, I think I'll just sit here and stream movies for like crazy, or, seeing God in the clouds. Suddenly we have this spell from July into October of everybody's running around on fire, pushing their own, being very, very forward with everything they want to do.
And that's July through October?
Mm-hmm. So how does that track with what you're picking up?
Yeah, a couple things. Jupiter, I've always been a fan of astrology and just, the universe. And without Jupiter, we always say Jupiter's our big brother, because Jupiter actually blocks and protects us as a planet. It actually takes on a lot of asteroids and comets that would, normally actually hit Earth. So I've always kind of looked at Jupiter as the big brother protecting us in the solar system here. And as far as, you said all life, to me, that's interesting because, in a few weeks, in fact, when I'm on your show on the 27th, that week before, they're going to launch the James Webb Telescope. And this $14 billion telescope is going to give us a very detailed view of different planets in our universe. And you said all life. And so I'm thinking, well, is that just all life here on planet Earth? Or is there more life out there that we're going to be talking about that will actually tie into, this transformation of awareness? And I'm not necessarily talking little green men here, but I am talking about other life, on the discovery of other life based on what this telescope can do for us. So it's a very interesting concept that you said all life. I'm thinking past planet Earth, to be honest with you.
No argument.
Now, of course, everybody listening to the show will be like, we got our tinfoil hats on and our conspiracy theorists, but I've been watching a lot of what's going on in information, government reporting, sightings. There's a lot of interesting things that are happening with the ufology and the unidentified aerial phenomenon, and I call it the drip, drip, drip. More and more information continues to seep out, and now we actually have official government reports saying that there is a phenomenon out there that we don't understand and we haven't been able to identify. So stay tuned for that in 2022, because there'll be more of that.
Makes complete sense to me. I mean, you can look at Pisces as the interconnectedness of all consciousness, which does not tie it down to the planet. It can be energetic. I see this as possible.
Yeah, and it's just so interesting to me because every day is a miracle, right? We live on this round planet in the vastest space that goes around a big ball of fire. So, we get so caught up in our lives that we forget about the bigger picture, what's going on. And, what I love about your work, Kathy, is you're same as me. You look at patterns, you look at symbolism, you look at pulp culture references, because a lot of what's going on in our pop culture references has been very interesting to watch. The social media, the construct of creating two different realities. To be honest with you, I could be sitting next to one person that has a completely different reality than my own, and a lot of that's based on our technology and how technology is driving us, separating us. But also, I think that technology will take a turn and start to bring people together, and get rid of this misinformation and disinformation that we have. But that's also part of the transformation and that chaos that we're going through, and coming back to a balance of peace and realizing we're better together than apart. And once we see that, when we start to instead of having conflict, have conformity, or coming to an agreement on something, I think that's what you're going to see a lot of in 2022 22, but I think there's going to be a lot of unveiling in pop culture about secrets, people that have been doing nefarious things for years. It's all going to come into the light. The truth will come out, as the X-Files says. The truth is out there, and I think we'll see a lot of that in 2022.
Oh, I agree with that. But I want to just touch on one thing. There's an interesting convergence of fantasy culture, pop culture, and science that happened with William Shatner going up in a spaceship.
Right.
That's just mind-boggling to me, that the man who typifies the future of space from a theatrical point of view and for a cultural point of view actually physically went up in space.
Mm-hmm. And that just tells you right there that, that's what we're looking at in our next Roaring 20s. So we're going to go to our first break, and when we come back, we're going to pick this up and continue our conversation with our guest today, Kathy Buell, professional astrologer, writer, attorney, small business owner. She's doing it all, but she's here as our professional Aquarian today, having an inspired chat here on Inspired Living Radio. So we'll be back here in just a few moments. Stick around. We'll be back. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Inspired Living Radio. Our special guest today, professional astrologer Kathy Buell, friend and colleague also over at Best American Psychics. You can check her website out at empowermentunlimited.net. Kathy, welcome back.
I'm happy to be here.
Well, so happy that you're here, and I'm just going to read a quote from the famous banker J.P. Morgan. Millionaires don't use astrology, billionaires do. And, for our work that we do as astrologers, as numerologists, as psychics, a lot of people come to us looking for, Kathy, tell me my future. What does the year ahead hold for us? And I always remind our listeners, the best part about our future is it comes one day at a time. So start doing what you want today so you can create that future you want for tomorrow. But let's continue to talk about James T. Kirk, because if you go a little bit deeper with him going to space, which I watched, cried like a baby, the nerd in me was totally geeking out over the whole thing and watching that. And, I always go back to Gene Roddenberry, who wrote the Star Trek series. He was known as a seer. And I know a lot of the work you do, Kathy, is not just astrology, but as a seer. Where do you see us going in 2022? What do you see coming up for us?
I think that things are going to calm down considerably. And we have one more, this isn't going to be as rocky a year as the last couple of years have been. There's one moment that's kind of like going up to a rickety structure that's been hit a lot and taking your finger and going flick, and then whatever needs to fall will fall, and that happens late in the fall. But other than that, this is not a year of getting hammered every time we turn around. There could be some wound licking. There could be a lot of finding a higher purpose, finding a lot of inspiration. The time between February, March, and April is actually extremely intense in terms of really committing to and getting very clear on what you absolutely have to physically have in your life, your structures, long-term goals, what your heart truly needs. It's like Santa baby on steroids time. But there's a softness about it, which is odd because of what Jupiter is up to. So we kind of regroup, get really intensely clear, and then fly into action for a few months, and then regroup and kind of sit and take a lot of baths and assimilate as we move out of the year. And that's a weird way of putting it, but this is an extremely unusual year for us. I did a summit a month ago with another astrologer, and when she and I were planning this, we had a devil of a time wrapping our minds around what's actually going to happen, because there's a huge cloudiness and lack of form to a lot of what's coming. If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it makes perfect sense, and I'm right there with you. And just for our listeners out there too, Kathy and I don't compare notes. This is the first time that we're talking on the air. We didn't talk before the show. We didn't compare notes, and I'm picking up the exact same thing. I'm picking up based on my meditations, based on my connection with just my auric field. What I see from a numerology standpoint is the year is still going to have its historical turbulent moments, especially when truths are revealed, because you'll have people that agree with that, you'll have people that disagree with that. But from a numerology standpoint, there's 3 vibrations of the number 2. And when you look at that number 2, it's vibrating duality. It's vibrating balance and adaptability and faith and trust, but also cooperation and diplomacy. And I still think that we're going to see, especially here in the United States with this pandemic, we're going to still see the misinformation and the disinformation, whether it's politics or the sycophancy or the pandemic. But I think a lot of people are really burned out. I think a lot of people are ready to move forward and really start to heal and to find that balance. And at the same time, what we're seeing in society, you talked about seeing the patterns of pop culture. You're seeing people at a mass scale resign from their jobs. It's called the Great Resignation. You've not seen that before at least in my lifetime. I've not seen over the last 4 months, 12 million people quit their jobs because they want to find purpose and a passion and are planning to do something, including starting a small business like what you and I run. So that to me is a sign and is a pattern emerging, because as Eckhart Tolle reminds us, awareness is the greatest agent for change. And that awareness isn't fun to, it's just like when the caterpillar goes through its metamorphosis to become the butterfly. That's not a fun phase, but that's where we're at. Since 2020, when I talked about this in 2019, 2020 and 2021 are cocoon years. And we're starting to slowly emerge, but I do see it's going to be a year of hope, and it's going to be a year of getting back to basics, a duality, adaptability, faith, trust, all those that I was saying, cooperation and diplomacy, because it's represented on 3 2s in 2022.
I'm sitting here nodding while you're talking.
Everybody can see you nodding because we're on internet radio.
Of course. Yeah, that's right. Now, interestingly, this business of growing awareness parallels what's been happening with the eclipses we've been under since 2019, which have been dealing with the power of thoughts and beliefs, like the real world ramifications, things that you might think are theoretical, but actually have a huge impact. And the last new moon, which was a solar eclipse at the beginning of, it's December, I don't even know what month we're in now, ended the cycle and shot us in a new direction. And I am seeing people not just resigning from jobs, not just realizing that the way they view themselves and the world is radically different than it was 2.5 years ago, but I'm seeing massive changes in all kinds of relationships as a result of people saying, you know what, just doesn't feel good anymore. I don't want to do this. Or there is a part of me that isn't getting expression here, so I'm moving on. It's just fascinating to me. That's the real epidemic I personally am observing. I read about people leaving their jobs, but I am witnessing relationships basically cratering, unraveling, and not always because anyone committed some heinous, unforgivable act, although there are a few of those floating around. So we're just changing, it's a huge time of adaptation. And next year, starting last month, we moved into the next eclipse cycle, which really does put our focus very much on the world, our toys, our money, our talents, really tangible things, because this next cycle is in the signs of Taurus and Scorpio, which are the I have, I possess signs. Scorpio is Gollum, my precious, like I want to hang on to it. So we're going from the changes in our perspective and our lenses to, okay, now we're going to reevaluate what's actually physically in our lives.
Mm-hmm. I was just thinking of the seagulls from Finding Nemo, where they're like, mine, 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 mine.
Yes.
So I want to read a quote from Edgar Cayce because I love the Sleeping Prophet because he was somebody that was very in tune and used astrology a lot, and he talked about astrology as a fact in most instances, but astrologic aspects are but signs, symbols. No influence is of greater value or of a greater help than the will of an individual. Do not attempt to be guided by, but use the astrologic influences as the means to meet or to overcome the faults and failures, or to minimize the faults and to magnify the virtues in self. And that's from Edgar Cayce. And when I was preparing for the show, that quote kind of, I think we live in the Matrix, Kathy, because when I'm doing something in my mind, all of a sudden in social media or soon to be the metaverse, it like pops up. And so I saw this quote from Edgar Cayce. I'm like, well, I'm doing a show on astrology today with Kathy. I'll bring that into the show because it really is to minimize the faults of others and to magnify the virtues of self, because we only change the world if we change ourselves. And I found that to be just a very powerful quote.
I agree. Absolutely. With all of it. I mean, my life is just a whole series of weird coincidences. So the fact that you stumbled on this makes perfect sense to me.
I know. And like I said, I'm starting to realize that the movie The Matrix, because there's a new Matrix coming out here this month, it's, to me, it's no longer a movie. It's more of a documentary based on everything that's unfolded for us. So, Osho talks about astrology as well. He says, if you can perceive this wholeness, only then will you understand astrology. Otherwise, you will not understand. And so for our listeners out there, start to look at the world with a bigger, broader set of eyes, because this year in 2022 are going to start to take the blinders off to a lot of things, not just in what we see in our physical world, but things that are unseen. Medicine is going to change. Philosophy, science is going to change. This pandemic is changing us because it's not seen, right? This pandemic we know exists, but we can't see it with the physical eye. So I always remind people, just because you don't see it doesn't mean it's not there. And we have three eyes in life to look. Two of our eyes are to see the physical world, and that third eye is to see the spiritual world. And for any of you scientists out there, the pineal gland or the pineal gland has the same makeup construct as our eyeballs. So think about that for a second. Fluid, the tissues, very similar to our physical eyes. So that's why we're given three eyes to look, two to see and one to actually see what's not seen.
That's fascinating.
So yeah, that's the cool thing about the work we do is we're always prospecting. We're always learning things from a science standpoint, from a spiritual standpoint, from a mystical standpoint. Astrology has always been fascinating to me, Kathy, but I'll be honest, I wasn't into this. I wasn't into seeing these patterns and this symbol, the signs, the symbols, the synergy, and the synchronistic events I talk about. It was only after I came through a very traumatic part in my personal life that it kind of opened me up and changed me. But you've had this your whole life or since you were a little girl. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Oh yeah, I've been inclined toward things that you can't verify in physical reality from a very, very young age. I mean, I have Pisces rising and Venus in Pisces, so I've been off in fairy tales all my life. But and as a preteen, I started reading any kind of metaphysical or esoteric book I could get my hands on. By my senior year in high school, I really honed in on astrology and tarot, the two things I really liked, and I ended up studying astrology starting in my mid-20s, and it's been my relationship with it has evolved from a kind of data-driven thing to much more seeing the patterns, I look at celestial clockwork, I look at when something gets sensitized and how that ties to things in the past, and when there are events in the future that are going to hit that same point. And I think this has made my forecasts really, really accurate as a result. But one thing that utterly fascinates me, something will happen, particularly in the news or involving somebody portraying a historical figure on a show or the media, and I will go, let me see what the chart is for this. And there's always something astonishing. Last week, I watched a documentary about Dean Martin, maybe it was 2 weeks ago, and it was on the Taurus full moon lunar eclipse. And I thought, gee, I wonder what Dean's chart looks like. Well, he had a pile up of stuff in Taurus that full moon, that eclipse was activating. And so I wrote a long thing on Medium about it, because it was time for him to get a new look. And now he's all over the place. PBS is running a holiday special he did with Frank Sinatra. It's just one of those things like, okay, it's his time. Same thing happened with Bob Fosse and Gwen Verdon a couple of years ago. I saw an airing of Holland Taylor doing a one-woman show about Ann Richards, and her chart and Richards' chart and the timing of the airing all interacted in just an utterly fascinating way. So I'm always writing about these things, like maybe 5 other people are interested, but the links are there, and who knows what it means. It just means there's this connection. I find it incredible.
Yeah, I do too. And, the balance of it, though, the duality of it is, I call it the spiritual burden of, having this insight of, things that haven't yet happened, but you're getting it, whether it's your writing or your meditations or your dreamscape or your prayers, whatever that may be. Because I really do look at us, I look at the human construct as like a computer. Really, if you think about our brain and you think about our DNA structure and our energy, and how energy runs down our spine, and we have the ability to connect. The question becomes: are people wanting to connect, and do they want to see, or do they just want to go about their lives? Which, it's again back to the Matrix. For those of us that get unplugged, you realize that there's a whole world out there, or as Elizabeth Davis says, she said, astrology enables us to feel a connection to this lifetime, as if our existence holds actual weight as thanks to our origination amongst the starry skies. Because they always say that we're stardust, right? So we're connected to our universe in so many different ways, and ashes to ashes, dust to dust, right? So, astrology is fascinating. I do the same thing when I'm seeing things. I look it up, not so much from an astrology standpoint. I'm more of a numerologist for the fact that I really sucked in high school at math. I hated math. I didn't like algebra, geometry, calculus. I did them, but I didn't see the meaning of them. And then after my spiritual awakening, I really started to see these numbers, patterns and synchronicities and sequences. And I'm like, what is this? And that really unlocked my world to look ahead based on numbers. And, for our listeners out there, you may not know this, but mathematics was not created by humans. Mathematics was discovered by humans. There's a big difference to that. So there's a whole language that Kathy and I are tapping into, whether it's the astrology and the charts based on planets. That's, I don't know, how old is astrology, Kathy?
I couldn't even give you a number.
I could tell you numerology is about 10,000 years old as far back as we can track based on records. So the philosophy is there. The history is there. But I'm sure astrology is probably 3 times older than that, because we've always looked up, right? We've always looked up and asked the bigger question: who are we? Why are we here? Are we alone? What are these things moving around us? And then, it's just it's interesting, but at the same time, trying to balance that, because for the last 2 years, seeing what I saw coming was a very uncomfortable place to be. So there was a lot of cloudiness. There was a lot of divide and a lot of turmoil. And I'm just thinking, oh my gosh, are we looking at, some sort of national divorce here in the United States, or some sort of revolution or second civil war? And I talked about that on my previous episodes that you can go listen to. And I still think that some of that can still unfold because it needs to. But for our listeners out there, 2022 is going to be a year of hope, and it's also a master builder year. So we're going to go to our final break, and when we come back, we're going to be talking about building up for 2022, some things to expect, and some things maybe you can work through on your spiritual journey. So stick around. We'll be back here in just a few minutes with our special guest, Kathy Buell, Professional Astrology, here on Inspired Living Radio. And welcome back to Inspired Living Radio. Make sure to check out our Facebook page, Inspired Living Radio, and join the global community of inspired listeners from all around the world. You can also follow us over on Twitter and Instagram at Inspired For Us. That's the number 4, Inspired For Us. And make sure to catch either this episode or the past few seasons of Inspired Living Radio on your favorite podcasting platform. We're now available on Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, SoundCloud, Podbean, Deezer. The list goes on on and on and on. And it's just so fun to do shows like this where we can talk about astrology, numerology, forecasting, prediction, transformation, and no better person to have on the show than my friend and colleague Kathy Buell, who is a professional astrologer, writer, tarot reader, lawyer, small business owner. She's kind of a performing artist. She's kind of an underachiever, I like to say, but she's getting things done in life, and she's been doing this with her intuition and rational mind for over 30 years. If you want to check her out, please do so at her website, empowermentunlimited.net. Kathy, let's continue the conversation because, man, the time just flies, doesn't it?
It sure does. Where do you want this to go now?
Well, let's talk about 2022, because I see it as a master number. When you break the numbers down, 20 is kind of that opposing energy. 22 is a master builder number, and it's just interesting with all of the conversations we see in pop culture about infrastructure and building new and transformation from, gasoline to electricity. In 2022, are you seeing any big events or any thing to do with infrastructure or I don't know, anything from an astrology standpoint that would be mindful to note in 2022 that the charts would tell us?
Well, Pluto, the influence of metamorphosis and transformation, is in the late degrees of the sign of Capricorn, which has to do with institutions, foundations, and guess what? Infrastructure. And it is going to be meeting with Venus, which is what we value, and Mars, which is how we go after things, in March or so. Venus and Mars are traveling together, in Capricorn for most of the February and March. And Venus is meeting Pluto twice this month, and then once again right before spring starts. All of this, to translate, means we're dealing with really fundamental things about where we want to go in the long term, and it completely touches on infrastructure. I will add to this that we have another outer planet influence that's around for the first time since the late 30s. So we have a recurrence of New Deal energy at the same time that this is happening. And I would think that there's going to be a huge push toward not just revising and revamping and dealing with, updating, upgrading our infrastructure, but also the whole notion of clean energy will be really big in all of this as well.
Oh, that's very interesting, that infrastructure, that actual word. It's interesting that actually comes up in the charts, right? Because, again, we're using two different philosophies and modalities, but we're seeing the same thing based on astrology and numerology, which I find fascinating. I find it, kind of mind-blowing. And, infrastructure, I was doing a little bit of writing on my next article that's getting ready to come out. And, from a master builder standpoint, the 22-4, if you embrace the 22 as a master number, that's all about master building. But if you don't embrace it, then it's the 4 energy, which is still that dedicated work energy, the workforce and putting the work in. But what's interesting is, if we can attain self-mastery, and this is a word, there were a couple words I gave a couple years ago on my prediction show before the Roaring 20s hit. And the words were sustainability, self-mastery, homeostasis, and the great coming together. Now, that was 2 years ago that I talked about this. And in 2022, I do see us reaching a new level of consciousness, a new energy to build or create or promote something that's going to benefit the community or humanity as a whole. Here's an example. One of the actors that I follow, he is going to change his salary to be a non-for-profit actor.
Yes, and I saw that.
I thought that was very, very interesting. That an actor who gets paid millions and millions of dollars is going to be able to live within his means, sustainability, and then take the extra money and pay it forward to causes or communities or, we have a real problem with capitalism in America, and that's kind of seen with the homelessness even here in Seattle. And I just thought it was interesting, and I think that's where that consciousness is going to shift, where you start to see athletes or actors or billionaires that they're going to start applying it because as of right now, to my understanding, there's no planet B, there's no second Earth, so we need to take care of the planet we have, and we have to do it together. And I just thought it was I thought it was a very cool thing to see one of the actors become a non-for-profit actor, because I've never seen that language before. But it would be right in line with where we're going.
There's an aspect of what Michael Sheen has chosen to do that I think ties into this. He's now moved back to his home country of Wales, and being there after being in the U.S. for a number of years, he discovered that certain support organizations that used to exist have cratered lately. So he's plowing his money back into his home community. And I think there's a big aspect of that we'll be seeing more and more and more. An example of that is Mackenzie Bezos, Jeff Bezos' ex-wife, who received half of the greatest fortune on the planet, and she's been plowing her money into education. And her second husband is a high school science teacher. How's that for a change?
Yes, he is. Yeah, that's local here in Seattle. Yeah, I know the story well. That is a great example of the shift of consciousness that we're going to continue to see in 2022. It's going to involve different projects, different organizations, different services, and I really do see that this is going to be the bridge between the material and the spiritual in 2022. There's some sort of bridge here, because people are realizing that it's not all about the material, it's not all about the mighty dollar. Otherwise, you wouldn't have 12 million plus people resigning from their jobs, right, to make money. So that, to me, from a higher perspective, is a shift in consciousness. And looking at money, but also knowing that money doesn't need to run your life, that there are many other things out there that you can explore and prospect and discover. And astrology and numerology are two of those ways that you can tap into that. So I try to keep it positive on Inspired Living, but anything nefarious or anything negative we have to keep an eye out for in 2022 from an astrology standpoint?
Possibly becoming just out to lunch, unhinged. If you have any bent toward excessive escapism, if you have an issue with substances, you might find yourself going way overboard, like limitless in April. That is a possibility. Now, it has the flip side of phenomenal creativity and inspiration, but I do want to caution that the cosmic fog machine will be running in overdrive. So if you're someone who can work your way through a bottle of wine in a couple of hours, you might want to take note of this. That might not be the way that you really want to go through this. Secondly, gaslighting, lying, whatever, I think could possibly increase to such a point that we just laugh. I mean, it could be a moment of Oz blowing up, the big face of Oz in front of us just disintegrating because it's become so ridiculous. That is possible as well. The third thing is your attitude and your beliefs about your money are going through a real change. So a lot of people have this incredible fear about what will happen with the economy. I personally don't feel or see it, but do know that your relationship to material resources is up for revisiting and revision. So if you have scarcity issues floating around in your subconscious, they may pop up and bite you.
Yeah, very, very interesting. Because I watch a lot of, being in medicine myself, I watch a lot of the trends and patterns based on mental health, suicide rates, suicide tendencies based on younger children and teenagers and adults. And you can really see it's a reflection of society. But the one thing that's been interesting to watch unfold from this as well, from this pandemic and the gaslighting, is, I like the analogy you said of Oz kind of blowing up. I like that analogy. Is I see the use of misinformation and disinformation within the technology of our social media becoming to a point of a national security, where it becomes, certain standards need to be enacted so you don't create two realities. One that's, a false reality of the emperor's new clothes, and then another reality that's based on, math and science and truth. And I see that coming into play in 2022. More oversight, kind of like when the television was first introduced in 1949. It came into the homes of, millions of Americans, those that could afford a television at the time, and they had the Fairness Doctrine Act, which was based on information that had to be presented in a professional, factual, journalistic standard. And I think you're going to see more of that to help with the gaslighting and the misinformation and the disinformation, and maybe that's part of that Oz that you talked about blowing up. But as far as the 22 theme in a master builder year, we just passed an infrastructure bill, which I found one of the biggest packages we've ever passed since the New Deal during Roosevelt's era, which was back in the 40s. So that's interesting because that would tie into both of what we're seeing from an astrology and numerology standpoint. Mm-hmm. But getting back to the mental health, because that's what's really unfolded, is the awareness of mental health from athletes to pop icons talking about the mental struggles. That's not something that we always talked about in society. That was actually kind of a faux pas and a weakness or a crutch, or we just don't talk about that. And that in the last 2 years has really come to light because of this pandemic and because of our politics and this sycophancy that we've been going through. And I think we're going to move forward with better awareness and understanding for mental health. And 2022 will be getting back to that normalcy of rebuilding our lives. Also becoming aware of, what we've done in the last 2 years during a pandemic, right? Netflix movies and binge drinking, or, whatever vice that we, have in our lives. I think that will be kind of like, get outside again and actually go back to working, because COVID will be with us, guys, until there's a cure. COVID will be around in society, just like smallpox or polio was, or even the AIDS virus that's been around since the 1980s. So we'll learn to live with it and to adapt to it and use medicine and science to get past it. So I'm looking at the great coming together in 2022. I'm looking at it as a year of hope, based on what the numbers are telling me, based on what my intuition is telling me, and my crystal ball that I have here in front of me as a psychic. I
have two, by the way.
I know you do.
I have two crystal balls.
Only two? Are you sure?
Only two. Yes, I only have two, but I have two. What I like to ask my guests before we end the show is any words of wisdom, or what inspires you, or who inspires you, and just share that with our listeners. I would say you've become aware more and more. You've become much more conscious in the last couple of years of what's really going on inside of you and what truly matters to you in your life. And I would say dare to be honest with yourself. Dare to speak up. Brief example. Two friends of mine from vastly different parts of my life had dinner with me this weekend. One of them was very hesitant to come because the other one and I often fall into reminiscing and talking about things that don't involve her. I said, if that you see that happening, speak up. And I watched this volcanic buildup in her, and she finally just said something, and we both went, oh, and we shifted the conversation. And she has brought it up 3 times since then. I kept saying, I told you to be honest. You were honest. I applaud you. Thank you. So be honest. Speak up. You don't have to be mean. Just be honest. And it simplifies so many things if you do that.
Great wisdom. And that's how I always finish my shows, talking about our words matter, and kindness and caring. And Kathy, it's been a pleasure having you on the show today. Thanks so much for hanging out with me this last hour and just talking about all things. Buell's website, you can go to empowermentunlimited.net. You can find her through Best American Psychics. Any other things that you want to give a shout out to that people can get a hold of you on?
Oh, I'm on, I have the Astro Insight Lounge on Facebook, and on YouTube, I'm Professional Aquarian.
Love it. And thanks for contributing to my Soul Adventures page. I love your articles.
Thank you so much.
With that, with that, everybody, thanks for listening today. We'll be back for another episode here of Inspired Living Radio. I'm going to just leave you with a little bit of Albert Einstein philosophy. Astrology is a science in itself and contains an illuminating body of knowledge. It taught me many things, and I'm greatly indebted to it. So until our next soul adventure together, be kind, be caring, be compassionate. Most importantly, dare to dream, dare to explore, dare to live, and discover that diamond within. Take care, everybody. Happy holidays.